Take a look at the Gilgamesh epic, which you read, and we'll summarize the story, and I'll give you a few comments of what scholars think about Gilgamesh, and also some of my own personal feelings about it. And then we will look at an ancient city in Syria, which dates the time of the early dynastic, called Ebla. And we're going to look at the cuneiform archive that was found there. It's a very important city in several regards. In one important respect, it generated a huge amount of information about the emergence of cities in the Levant, in that sort of Eastern Mediterranean region, through archaeology and also through the texts, the cuneiform documents that were found. Okay, there are different stories about Gilgamesh besides the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, and it looks like stories about Gilgamesh go back, probably to the early dynastic. Gilgamesh is listed on the king's list. Scholars think he was king of Uruk, maybe around 2700, 2600 BC. So we're talking about the early part of the early dynastic period. There are various tales about him, but the later epic that was finally written down in the 7th century BC is different than some of the earlier versions. The earlier versions are much more straightforward adventure kind of stories, and the epic that you read is more nuanced. It has more depth, and it's really less of a sort of simple story. In one of the early tales of Gilgamesh, there's a war between Uruk and Kish, and within that story we hear about a council of elders. And so it seems that in early dynastic Mesopotamia, the king's rule was not absolute, but that there were probably heads of important families that formed some sort of assembly or council, and they had some sort of say in the goings-on in the kingdom. One scholar, Thorkild Jacobson, he wrote sometime, I think, in the 30s. He called this sort of a proto-democracy, but many scholars would not use that term and disagree with his use of the term because it's not really a democracy. Okay, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest known epic poem, and it tells the story of this semi-divine mythic hero, Gilgamesh. And there probably was a real king named Gilgamesh, and who knows where the stories actually came from. They might have originated at different periods. Gilgamesh, it's interesting when you read the epic, and there are depictions of Gilgamesh or Gilgamesh-like figures, these sort of hero figures throughout the centuries in ancient Near Eastern art. Gilgamesh is not really a hero. He's the hero of the epic, but in terms of our standards, he doesn't seem very heroic. He's abusive to his people. He's kind of a tyrant. This is why the people cry out to the gods for help. Gilgamesh seems to sort of grow as a person through the epic, but certainly he starts out as not very likable in the beginning, even though he's the central figure. We might say that Enkidu is more of today what we would consider to be more of a hero, right? Because Enkidu really doesn't do anything wrong in the whole epic. And in fact, he does a lot of things that are right. Well, Enkidu is created by the gods. He's this kind of wild man, runs in the forest. People are scared. They come back to Gilgamesh to tell them about this wild man. Gilgamesh comes up with this plan to send Shamhat, who is a temple priestess, to seduce Enkidu. When they lie together for 7 days, Enkidu afterwards, none of the animals will approach him. He then is brought by Shamhat to see civilization, brought back to the city of Uruk. There he's given kind of a makeover, full body shave, I guess, and hears about the abuse of power by Gilgamesh. Goes back and confronts Gilgamesh as Gilgamesh is about to have the first night with a bride. They fight. It comes to a draw, and they end up being close friends. And there is debate about the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Some people believe that the epic clearly states that they are lovers. And that there's a sexual relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. It's expressed symbolically as Gilgamesh having a dream about an axe by his side, who then becomes Enkidu. It's mentioned as Gilgamesh says something like Enkidu was like a wife to him, I believe, at one point in the epic. So certainly you can make a strong argument for that being the case. Then Gilgamesh convinces Enkidu to go up to the cedar forest. This is probably the area of Lebanon today. That area throughout history of the ancient Near East was known as an important resource for wood. They go up there and they encounter the monster Humbaba. And Humbaba was put there by the gods to protect that forest. This is a depiction of Humbaba. You can see what kind of these sort of, it looks like intestines because it's supposed to be intestines. One of the ways of foretelling the future, as we said, was to look at the entrails of animals. If a diviner sacrificed a sheep and pulled out the small intestines and it looked like the face of Humbaba, that was considered to be a bad omen. So there are different depictions of Humbaba. Gilgamesh and Enkidu fight Humbaba. And as Humbaba is dying, he begs for mercy, and also, states, why are you killing me? I was just put here to protect the forest. So some people almost see this as kind of a proto-environmental activist almost tale. This portion of the epic, right? That it's talking about humanity's destructive force when it comes to resources and nature. And Gilgamesh is essentially going up against the will of the gods here, right? The gods put Humbaba there to protect the forest, and he kills Humbaba. And that does not please the gods at all. We then get to the point where Ishtar tries to seduce Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh goes through a whole long litany of previous lovers of Ishtar that ended up having unfortunate ends and refuses her. And the Council of Gods decide to send down the Bull of Heaven to punish Gilgamesh. And the Bull of Heaven comes down, starts smashing the walls of Uruk. Enkidu and Gilgamesh have to again wrestle with the Bull of Heaven, and Gilgamesh and Enkidu end up vanquishing the Bull of Heaven. But in the process, Enkidu is killed. Right, here's a cylinder seal that supposedly depicts Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and fighting off these wild beasts and monsters. So of course Gilgamesh is completely broken up by the death of his friend. But even more than that, he's worried about his own existence. Is he going to die? And the epic takes a very interesting turn at this point. It starts out as a story of these two heroes, these adventurers. You could almost say it's the first sort of buddy flick. And then when one dies, it's this kind of existential, philosophical journey that Gilgamesh must now take to search out the survivor of the great flood and ask him the secret of everlasting life. So he goes down, he crosses the river protecting the underworld. He encounters the scorpion guardians of the underworld, gets ferried across the river, and there hears the story of the flood from Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim recites the flood narrative, which goes back even before the Gilgamesh epic. And in the ancient Sumerian version, the fellow's name who survives the flood is Ziusudra. And it's a little bit different in the telling. And we're going to learn a little bit about some of the documents related to the flood narrative, right? And I'll just point out that there, recently, a few years ago, they found a missing fragment of the Gilgamesh epic. So hopefully with further excavations, they'll turn up tablets that fill in the blanks in some of the story. Anyway, Gilgamesh learns that a certain plant can give him immortal life, but he's supposed to stay up first. I think it's something like 7 days straight without sleeping. Can't do it. Fails that test. Then the plant that he acquires is eaten by a snake. So the end is a real bummer in a sense. He completely loses out. He can't get eternal life, but he reflects on that and he realizes that everyone has to die at some point. And some people believe that a message of community, right, being part of a community is what sort of keeps you alive essentially for eternity. As individuals we die, but the community goes on. And so it's very, very sort of philosophical at the end. When I first read the Epic of Gilgamesh, I was expecting something more like Beowulf. And, as a student in college, I had only read the epic up to where he kills Grendel and then Grendel's mother. I'd not read the whole thing the whole way through. But at least up to that point, it's a very simple good versus evil. I mean, there is obviously some nuance. There's some debate as to whether, the Grendel, the monster, is really a victim in all of this. But Gilgamesh is a lot more nuanced and a lot more sophisticated than I was expecting the first time I read it. Right? Remember that this goes back to 600 something BC. Beowulf dates to maybe 800 AD, maybe 600 AD. So we're talking about a long time span in between. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, again, for all of its philosophy and nuance, is a very sophisticated text. I think many of you probably were surprised by just how many common human themes were brought up in the epic. And even though it's a very ancient tale, it still has a lot of relevance for people today. Okay, we're going to look at some other texts that a lot of them come at the end of the early dynastic period as again, the language and the writing becomes more fluid and more adaptable to the oral language of Sumerian, and also later sources that were copied from earlier Sumerian sources. So we're just going to kind of talk about them as a whole. And we're going to sort of look at a couple of different texts. Some of them I'll read to you, but I'm not going to read them all out loud because, again, that would take a long time. So you can just pause and read the whole thing yourselves if you'd like to. But we get a lot of texts. Most of the texts are economic, but we're getting things like temple archives, royal inscriptions like we saw on the stela of the vultures. But there are other texts that give us kind of a window into everyday life in ancient Mesopotamia. And one of the experts on the ancient writing system was a professor who worked at the University of Pennsylvania. His name was Samuel Noah Kramer. He worked in the 30s, 40s, 50s, I think even up to the 60s. And one of the things he's known for today is writing some very important popular books about ancient Mesopotamia. And sort of he brought the history of Mesopotamia to everyday people by talking about some of these texts. And he has He had a couple of books. One of them, History Begins at Sumer. And in this book, he talks about the world's firsts. And he has a whole long list of the first this, the first that. And some of them are like the first schools, where some of the texts actually describe how a school was organized. Texts talk about the professor, the student, the teaching assistant, the man in charge of drawing, the man in charge of Sumerian, the man in charge of the whip, right? Girls and women also learned how to write, as we're going to see. The majority were men, but there were important women. We're going to read about one of them in a period just coming up, in the very next period, the first female author in history. Okay, there are practice tablets, mathematical tablets, poems, literature. Right? So if you went to school, you might have to solve a math problem, like a trigonometry problem or geometry problem. You would have to do, basic mathematical functions. There were tables that looked a little bit like multiplication tables. Here's one that kind of gives you a window into, corporal punishment in schools. The headmaster read my tablet. There's something missing. Then he caned me. The fellow in charge of the dress code said, "Why are your clothes so messy?" Then he caned me. And you can see the rest of it goes on and on and on. He's getting caned. And at the very end, he says, "So I began to hate the scribal art." This is a funny one. The first case of apple polishing. Right? A student is not doing very well in school. And the student realizes that he's not doing very well, talks to his father, suggests to his father that they invite the teacher over for dinner. The teacher was brought home from school. After entering the house, he was seated in the seat of honor. The schoolboy attended and served him, and whatever he had learned of the art of tablet writing, he unfolded to his father. The father dressed the teacher in a new garment, gave him a gift, put a ring on his hand. The teacher then addresses the student. "Young man, because you did not neglect my word, did not forsake it, may you reach the pinnacle of the scribal art. May you achieve it completely. Of your brothers may you be their leader. Of your friend may you be their chief. May you rank the highest of schoolboys. You have carried out well the school's activities. You have become a man of learning." Right? So I think it's a little bit more than apple polishing. Seems a little bit more like bribery. But hey, it worked, right? Even back more than 4,000 years ago. We also have, you remember that Irving Finkel guy from the British Museum on that video, probably. Very well-known scholar in cuneiform. He identified a little drawing on a school tablet, which he's convinced is a caricature of the teacher, right? So this bored kid learning cuneiform decided to draw his teacher, an unflattering portrait with nose hair sticking out. I think that's probably pretty accurate. Yeah. The first case of juvenile delinquency. Some of you may have heard this speech before. The father asked his son, "Where'd you go?" "I did not go anywhere." "If you did not go anywhere, why did you idle about? Go to school, stand before your school father, recite your assignment." Right? He goes on and on. "I never in all my life did I make you carry reeds to the canebrake. I never sent you to work as a laborer." Right? So the typical speech of a parent to a child that we sometimes hear, "Why are you acting like an idiot? Why are you so irresponsible? You should do this." And, it seems like from some historical texts that we read, it seems like every generation was complaining about the next generation since there were generations, right? Just like boomers will complain about Gen Xers will complain about millennials will complain about Gen Zers, etc. It really has more to do with differences in age and anything to do with generation. The first case of tax reduction. We're going to learn about this Urukagina, right? But, Lagos, with all these wars that they were having with Umma, there was a big kind of tax burden on the people. The cattle inspector sees the large cattle, sees the small cattle. If a man divorced his wife, the ishaku for 5 shekels, and his vizier got 1 shekels, right? So taxes, taxes, taxes. From one end of the state to the other, there were tax collectors. We're coming up on April now, tax season. And this was so burdensome to people that they actually rose up. And the new leader, Urukagina, came to power. And he reformed the system of Lagash, reduced taxes and bureaucrats, and created new freedoms. Right? And we're talking about, the poorest people in the society were really feeling the burden. The house of a lowly man was next to the house of a big man. The big man said to him, "I want to buy it from you." If when he, the big man, was about to buy it from him, the lowly man said, "Pay me as much as I think fair," and then he, the big man, did not buy it, the big man must not take it out on the lowly man. Right? So this is a way of preventing abuse of power, which we're still trying to do through legal means. Right? That is, there's not one system for the wealthy and another system for the poor. Unfortunately, his experiment in reform only lasted 10 years because Umma came back and actually conquered Lagash. And we're going to learn a little bit more about that because that sets up the stage for the next period of Mesopotamian history. Right? Many of you know about Hammurabi. We're going to learn a little bit about Hammurabi. He dates to around 1700 BC. Many people think of his law code as the earliest law code. It's not. The law code of Ur-Nammu, what we're going to learn more about, from sort of the end of the 3rd millennium, is the earliest law code that we have on record. And it's a very liberal law code. In fact, it's more liberal than the Code of Hammurabi. If a man to a man with a weapon, his bones of severed, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. When the merchant gives to his clerk grain, wool, oil, or some other merchandise for sale, the clerk shall give a strict account and turn in the money to the merchant, and the merchant shall give him, the clerk, a receipt for the money paid over to him. Yeah, when you think about it, I mean, think about how sophisticated the legal system is at this point, that you are legally required to provide receipts for these transactions. It's not just word of mouth. You actually have to provide a receipt. And so, they are codifying even the most basic laws that need to be enacted. When a man has bought a male or female slave and the sale is fought by a third party, the real owner, and it is in consequence therefore declared void, the seller of the slave has to pay for all the damages. Right? If a man has given his daughter a dowry and the daughter dies without an issue, the dowry reverts to the house of her father. The husband doesn't keep it. And this is something that is still a problem in some areas of the world today. You sometimes hear about legal disputes between arranged marriages of South Asian men and women, where maybe one person's living in India and the other person's living in the United States or Canada, and the marriage breaks off and the groom will not return the dowry money. It turns into a whole legal problem. First Proverbs, a little bit like our Proverbs, like a stitch in time saves 9, a penny saved is a penny earned, early to bed, early to rise, etc., etc. Right? Things that we read about from Ben Franklin's almanac and things like that. So, can one conceive without intercourse? Can one get fat without eating? True. We are doomed to die. Let us spend. We will live long. Let us save. So, sort of that, yes, carpe diem, but remember, you might wake up tomorrow. Some of these proverbs we can definitely relate to. As you'll see, some of them are, show that their culture is different. People were not exactly the same as we are today. Who possesses much silver may be happy. Who possesses much barley may be happy. But who has nothing at all can sleep. Who has not supported a wife or child, his nose has not borne a leash. For his pleasure, marriage. On thinking it over, divorce. Friendship lasts a day, kinship endures forever. That would be like blood is thicker than water. He did not yet catch the fox, yet he is making a neck stock for it. That would be like, don't count your chickens before they hatch. Who builds like a lord lives like a slave. Who builds like a slave lives like a lord. The state weak in armaments, the enemy will not be driven from its gates. That's, I guess the best defense is a strong offense kind of phrase. You can have a lord, you can have a king, but the man to fear is the tax collector. So even then they were complaining about taxes. Wealth is hard to come by, but poverty is always at hand. That which is given in submission becomes a medium of defiance. Sort of which definitely, I think some people can relate to today. Right? That is, if you're forced to work in a job you really hate, sometimes your only method of resistance is to either work as slow as possible or to not get things done, because you have no say in the matter. Your boss is basically has complete power and control. The poor are the silent ones of the land in terms of, power. All the households of the poor are not equally submissive. A poor man does not strike his son a single blow. He treasures him forever. Right? So sort of the idea that the less you have, the more you cherish it, I guess. A boat bent on honest pursuit sailed downstream with the wind. Utua saw that honest ports for it. He who drinks too much beer must drink water. Always a good rule of thumb. He who eats too much will not be able to sleep. True as well. Since my wife is at the outside shrine, and furthermore, since my mother is at the river, I shall die of hunger, he says. May the goddess Inanna cause a hot, limited wife to lie down for you. May she bestow on you broad-armed sons. May she seek out for you a place of happiness, kind of like a blessing. The fox could not build his own house, so he came to the house of his friend as a conqueror. Some people draw similarities between these ancient Mesopotamian proverbs and the biblical book of Proverbs, which has similar kinds of phrases. The Bible also has the Song of Songs, the book Song of Songs, which some people have drawn parallels to the ancient Mesopotamian cuneiform documents that have the first love song. Right? Bridegroom, let me caress you. My precious caress is more savory than honey. In the bedchamber, honey-filled, let us enjoy your goodly beauty. And it goes on further from there. The first golden age, right? So talking about we can always sort of look back in the past and think about how great it was and sort of downplay all the negative aspects of that time period. And people in ancient Mesopotamia were no different. Once upon a time, there was no snake, there was no scorpion, there was no hyena, there was no lion, there was no wild dog, no wolf, there was no fear, no terror. Man had no rival. We also have rental contracts, similar to what you would have to sign for your apartment. There are also marriage contracts, right? So that the husband has an obligation to the wife, and that they there was divorce in ancient Mesopotamia and things like that as well. Labor contracts, right, which are very strictly outlined. Because tablets that are in collections are being translated continuously, new things arise and new things appear. So let's take a look at some of the new discoveries that have been made recently.